Hello BookTube, I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading. I thought I would take a crack at recording a video after a long unplanned hiatus. Work kind of ate my brain for several months and maybe there's a little relief coming. I've made steady progress in my reading, but reading lots of stuff that have left me kind of going, meh, interesting enough distraction, but not something I'd particularly recommend to anybody. But I have a few exceptions of things I've finished recently. The first one I'd recommend is Beryl Bainbridge's early novel, Harriet Said. This was written in 1958, so one of her very early compositions, but not published until 1972. Bainbridge couldn't get the novel published, largely because of its subject matter. It's the story of two 13-year-old girls living in England, 13 or 14. There's the unnamed narrator and her much more seemingly experienced friend, Harriet. And it's the story of their encounters with the people around them and their attraction to and for some of the older men in their community. And as you can expect, bad things happen. It's a Bainbridge novel, so bad things happen. And from the opening pages, you're essentially waiting to see, okay, what bad thing is going to happen and to who. And in that way, it's really interesting to see Bainbridge being Bainbridge, tackling the same themes and with much the same tone so early in her writing career. The prose is very compressed, very tightly controlled. There's nothing extra in this novel at all. And there are lots of gaps in it in the way you'd expect there to be in a Bainbridge novel, and trying to understand what has actually happened when everything is being filtered through the viewpoint of a 13-year-old girl who's caught up in adolescent intensity and fantasies and the kind of immature rush to experience everything in life. It's quite a good novel, but I don't think it's much read anymore, and I'm not sure it's actually in print anymore. But if you can find a copy or find it in your library, I'd recommend it. It's startlingly good for a very early novel in her corpus. The next thing that I read recently and would recommend, I picked up for Women in Translation Month, one of my goals for this year, which I'm failing miserably at, which is pretty common for me in terms of reading goals. So not something to worry about, is something I picked up for Women in Translation Month. I picked up Marguerite Duras's The Lover. Many people will have already read this. I'm very, very late to the party on this one. This was published in 1984, and it goes nicely with the Bainbridge in a way, because it's about the story of a 15-year-old girl who's similarly caught up in intensity of wanting adult sexual experiences, and she ends up in a sexual and emotional relationship with a 27-year-old man. It's all set in Vietnam, where Duras was born. It's largely autobiographical. It's been fodder for films, and it's particularly well known. Mostly people talk about, when they're talking about Duras's novel, about The Lover, about its eroticism and its playing with interracial tensions, and that is indeed at the core of the novel. And the prose is kind of dreamy and fragmented and imprecise in some ways that are kind of the opposite of Bainbridge. So it's interesting to me in that kind of contradiction or difference. But what surprised me in reading it, what I didn't expect to find, was how much of the novel is actually about or interrupts itself to turn toward the relationship between the unnamed narrator, that 15-year-old, desperate for intense sexual experience, and her mother, and to a lesser extent her brothers. It's an uncommented upon, in the things I've read recently, aspect of the novel, and quite interesting. It ties in a way to Bainbridge's novel, the two girls in Harriet Said, because much of the novel is about the very broken relationships of those two 13-year-olds and their parents, who are largely absent or ineffectual, or oblivious, or ununderstood by their daughters at the very least. So Duras was was an interesting surprise. I'm not sure whether I will read another Duras soon. There's something about the prose that's both very interesting in the way it's wispy. As a Canadian, to be thinking about the nature of complicity at a time when we were spending more public time talking about and thinking about the impact of residential schools and what that genocide means and how we perpetuated it, how we enabled it, and how we benefited from it. Uncomfortable place to sit and to think, but I think for me in particular, crucial to spend some time thinking about the way I and my family, who have been in Canada or in North America since the 1600s, how have we been complicit? How have we benefited from all these structures that are inherently destructive and immoral? Difficult questions, but I'm going to sit with them from some more. So this week I plan to make some progress on 2 or 3 other books. The one I'm about halfway through is Mariam Kaba's We Do This Until We Free Us. This was published this summer. It's a collection of essays, journalistic pieces, thought pieces, published by Haymarket Books. Yes, Haymarket Books. They're all quite short, the ones I've read so far. So all of the essays are under 10 pages. It's very different in tone and approach than Rankine. So if you found Rankine a little tough going in places, you might like Kaba's book instead. It covers the same kind of ground that Angela Davis covers in Our Prisons Obsolete, or Michelle Alexander covers from a more academic point of view in The New Jim Crow. So the same kinds of ideas. Kaba is a prison abolitionist, and she's clear and thoughtful and has useful and easy to understand ideas that she articulates in these short pieces. I think some of these short pieces would actually make good material for discussion in classrooms because of how short they are. They're not shallow, but they're short and to the point, and they're accessible. The language is accessible, the ideas are accessible, and the points she's making are I think, important. 3 key ideas that are sticking with me so far is Kaba's phrase, hope is a discipline, that to be hopeful requires a certain kind of discipline, that you have to deliberately choose and act in a way to be hopeful. That I found a good reminder, especially as I'm thinking about the nature of complicity. The other thing that I'm quite enjoying in Kaba's book is her call for imagination, that what we need is not more punishment in the world. She's, after all, a prison abolitionist. What we need is more imagination, and that liberation will come from, in part, our ability to imagine alternatives to a largely dysfunctional prison system in North America. So that idea I found interesting. It's a very simple idea, and yet not. So I would recommend the Kaba, even though I'm about halfway through. The second thing of the three I'm working on this week is something else I picked up for Women in Translation Month. See if I can move my goal of reading more works in translation forward a little bit this month, is by Magda Szabo. She wrote The Door, so this is, which I read several years ago and enjoyed, but was unsettled by, which I think is part of the point of the novel, is, what is this called? Iza's Daughter. This one was published in 1963 and was written in Hungarian. It's the story of Etta, a woman in her 80s, and her daughter Iza, who's probably in her 30s or 40s, in the days immediately following the death of Etta's husband, Vince. So I've read the first quarter of it, and it's very much, at this point, a story about grief and disruption and rural customs in Hungary at death. And largely, I think it's going to be a novel about the relationship of the daughter and the mother, and the many and complex misunderstandings between them, because they come from two very different generations, influenced by two very different sets of political and historical realities. Since it's a novel about 1950s and 1960s Hungary, I need to fill in some gaps in my historical understanding of Hungary, which is very shallow. I think I'm missing a good chunk of the context, so I need to do a little bit of self-education around that, but I hope to finish it this week. Even though it's not a particularly cheery novel, it's not a summary sort of novel, it's a much darker, which isn't surprising given that it deals with death and grief and unhappy changes in characters' lives. So the third one I'm reading is a much sunnier book in many ways. It's Tove Jansson's The Sculptor's Daughter. This one was published in, 1968, and it's a memoir. It's, how to describe it? It's a very sunny book in many ways. It's very much centered in summer life in rural Finland, on an island, in a coastal situation. It's Jansson's memoir, vignettes of her memory of her childhood. So very, very light, very rural, and I think it's partly working over material that she later turns into a novel that I very much like and want to reread, the summer book, which was published 5 years later, 1973. So The Sculptor's Daughter is one of these child narrators, or it's not even a child narrator, it's Jansson remembering her childhood. And so it's got all the kinds of flaws that kind of narrative has, and it's very, very fragmented, very, very piecemeal. It's set up in terms of very short chapters, so it's easy reading, is very limited in its scope, but I think that's kind of the point of it, that it's very much about the tiny things that a child, or the remembered child, noticed. I'm not very familiar with Jansson's most well-known work, all of her Moomin works, so I come at this from trying to understand Jansson as a writer. Not sure what I think about it yet. I think in part I'm finding its fragmentedness a little frustrating, which is probably more of a sign that I'm a plot reader in many ways. I like a well-structured plot. One of the things that's interesting about Sculptor's Daughter for me is reading it a couple of weeks after I saw the movie Tove, which came out, I think last year, a Finnish movie about Jansson's life from the time she was in her early to mid-20s till the time she's in her 30s, maybe early 40s, kind of a tumultuous period in her life. And in the movie, it's very clear that the relationship between Jansson and her father, who was also an artist, he's a sculptor in the title of this book, it's represented as being very tense and very difficult. And the memoir, Sculptor's Daughter, gives you an entirely different perspective. It's the perspective of a 4, 5, 6-year-old child who idolizes her father. And the other thing it gives you insight into that you don't see in the movie is Jansson's relationship with her mother, who was also an artist. And that was one of the things I found frustrating in the movie, is that Jansson's mother is almost always, off on the side of the screen, has very little of a speaking part. You get a sense that she plays no role in Jansson's life or in her development as an artist. But if you poke at that kind of narrative that's put forward by the movie, it's not quite true. Jansson's mother was an artist. So I'm interested in those kind of contradictions between the memoir and the movie. There are always contradictions between memoirs and movies. So that's how my reading for Women in Translation Month is going, and the reading I have planned for next week. I hope you're doing well and that you are finding good, or at the very least interesting or entertaining books to keep you company. Bye-bye.